I've stated multiple times through many videos on my channel that the original Maji de Watashi Shinasai or Majikoi Love Me Seriously is my #1 favorite visual novel of all time, and it's not even close. However, I realize I haven't made a video specifically reviewing it, so that's what I'm going to do in this one. This won't be a traditional objective review where I give a score and tell people what it's about. You want to see that kind of review? There's plenty of other people who have reviewed the original Majikoi visual novel on YouTube. Instead, this is going to be more like a structured, edited rant where I explain what got me into Majikoi to begin with and very specific things I like a lot about it. I don't know how many people watching this video have been reading visual novels for over 10 years, but for those who have been in the visual novel scene since over a decade ago, you might remember that there was a time when Majikoi was just a partial fan translation. I actually got into the Majikoi VN when my online friend, who was my equivalent of a drug dealer for visual novels at the time, told me I would like this game based on the slice of life romance anime I liked. And wow, this game almost immediately blew me away. Emphasis on almost. See, at that point, Majikoi had the exact type of goofy, over-the-top comedy I really liked. However, when I started it up, I didn't know that was what I wanted at the time, since my favorite slice-of-life comedy anime at that point included stuff like Azumanga Daioh and Lucky Star, but Majikoi somehow went even further in its goofy over-the-topness. Thankfully, after about an hour getting used to the comedy, it ended up being the funniest thing I'd seen at the time, and still one of the best overall humor I've seen in visual novels and any weeb media to this day. Describing why I like Majikoi's comedy so much can be difficult since comedy is subjective and all that jazz. Just calling it goofy and over the top doesn't narrow things down, as there are series that technically do this kind of comedy that I don't like at all. With Majikoi, I appreciate that the characters are willing to constantly roast each other, but they do it out of love, especially within the Kazama family. Even the sidecast has their gimmicks. For example, Kokoro is ungodly full of herself, while Yukie uses her phone strap Matsukaze to bring out her secret, snarky, savage side. While some gimmicks may work for some characters and some not for others, I find that the vast majority actually worked for me more often than not. There is enough variation within these goofy jokes despite this being a 50+ hour visual novel where you get to see the same 30 to 40 characters pretty often. What also helps is that no one is safe from being made fun of or having a gimmick. Even Gakuto, who represents the more generic, openly perverted loser bro character, it's not like every male character is a complete loser. In fact, Toma from Class 2S is actually bisexual and good at getting the ladies, while the Kazama family leader, Shoichi, or Cap, is insanely lucky and popular with women, but he just cares more about his childlike sense of adventure than things like lust or love, except for one very important memorable moment in one specific route. While we're on the talk of various characters, long before I was a weird girl fan, I was much more into childhood friends. This visual novel having 3 potential childhood friend heroines who were part of the friend group growing up sounded like a dream come true for me. And speaking of dreams, Miyako was like the perfect fantasy for a relatively newer weeb like me. A busty childhood friend who's really open about confessing to you and even openly wanting to have sex? Younger, monkey brain version of me thought this was the hottest thing ever. Over time, I've recognized that Miyako is definitely a very toxic female character, which is part of the point, but I found more female VN heroines who are just as perverted and funny as her without being nearly as toxic. Still, I have to admit I have some nostalgia for Miyako since she set the bar really high for the types of heroines I would tend to prefer going forward. Going back to the main childhood friend group, this was ultimately possibly the biggest reason of many that I came to really like Majikoi. At the point that I'd read it, I'd seen multiple power of friendship stuff through cheesy shonen plots in anime and JRPGs to a smaller extent. Some slice of life anime had small groups of friends with decent wholesomeness. However, I thought Majikoi both back then and even now, as the Gen Zoomers like to say, clears every Japanese created high school friend group I've seen in fiction. The Kazama family doesn't need things like the power of friendship speeches to show how close they are. It's the ultimate case of show don't tell. The fact that they get excited just to walk to school together and joke around says a lot. When 2 new girls are recruited in and one is a straight up bitch calling their secret base an old waste of space that needs to be scrapped, she naturally gets almost all of them riled up. And when there's a moment when one of their friends gets beaten up by a bad guy, they will be there to get revenge. This is the beauty of the Kazama family, and they are overall the best done characters in the original Majikoi, with the true route Agave straight up being all about their bond. As much as I love the sequels Majikoi S and A fan discs for having lots of well done heroine routes, I'm personally saddened that the Kazama family has been much less consistently important throughout routes and themes over time. which is why I ultimately still prefer the original Majikoi over the mini sequels and fan discs. Having said that though, if it was just the Kazama family that were the only good characters in Majikoi, it would be at best a great visual novel for me, but not my all-time favorite. What helps elevate the already great main cast is the fact that the supporting cast is somehow both really big in number and memorable individually, something an ensemble cast from other visual novels and even other media struggle to replicate. From the overly bombastic Hideo and his super simp maid Azumi, to the resident extreme lolicon June, to the Kazama family's robot Cookie, and my personal favorite, the ever so relatable Suguru. Suguru was easily my favorite character in the non-main cast because of how hilarious he was in terms of making fun of extreme incel-like nerdy otakus. His constant complaints about the 3D world and women and how the 2D world was better were executed really hilariously to me. His humor never got old, to the point where he had some of my favorite scenes in the original Majikoi, like how he tased a girl in the Kawakami War in the Momoyo route for the girl trying to flash him, or how in another route he got ever so slightly attracted to Chika, which made him feel insecure about his love for 2D girls, so he purposely went to a brothel to make him heavily dislike the experience enough to go all in on hating 3D women for life so it would never happen again. Once again, it's a shame Suguru after the original Majikoi kind of became a more boring, snarky straight man character because he was amazingly hilarious in the original. One thing that tends to disappoint me in visual novels is action scenes, because story-heavy visual novels that feature them tend to have those scenes be ridiculously overly long and padded out with boring narration of fights and monologues, even though there are cool backdrop CGs to complement them. The Majikoi series does not have this issue, having fights that are quick and snappy while still being memorable. There's really cool text and even some funny punchlines as the basis for some fights. Sure, there's still the issue that many fights are just PNGs with loud sound effects, but when this is essentially a novel with a lot of text and characters, I appreciate that the fights generally don't take too long, but are usually good ways to advance the plot or character development. That brings me to what makes many of the heroine routes in Majikoi very memorable to me: the over-the-top random competitions. While some are straightforward one-on-one duels that the school can watch throughout the whole game, there's also route-specific huge competitions like the team-based Battle Royale in Yukie's route, and my personal favorite, the Kawakami War in Momoyo's route, which somehow puts all the characters of Class 2F versus 2S against each other, while giving each character defining roles with a great layer of strategy that Yamato and his rival Jun take advantage of, feeling like the whole thing's shouting out one of those old-school real-time strategy RPGs but with a hilarious comedic flavor. So I've talked a lot about the comedy and action parts of Majikoi, which are great, and the mixture of the two is at the core of most of the experience. But what about the more serious stuff like the romance and drama? Well, it turns out Majikoi is also really good at that too, which heavily surprised me as I was expecting lighthearted themes to be basically 95% of the time. As early as the common route, I actually like the drama where Chris, despite being a newer member of the Kazama family, quickly causes friction by criticizing the secret base that the friend group has been using for years. This scene understandably led many Majikoi readers I know to hate her, but for me, it was the opposite. It showed that even closed-minded people can change their hearts with good communication. This is the type of drama you rarely see in any media, let alone visual novels. It's a type you could potentially see in real life too. The drama in the heroine routes can be surprisingly good too. For example, everything about Yukie learning not to need Matsukaze was a really nice story. I personally liked how it took Miyako almost breaking up the friend group for her to finally grow past her toxic dependencies into a much better person. What many fans I know consider the standout drama in the original Majikoi is Wanko's route, straight up being the one route that's a really sad, emotional Nakiye in the whole series. I'll let you read her route for you to figure out why. I somehow got this far and haven't talked about the main protagonist, Yamato. Back when I first read this visual novel way back in the early 2010s, when it was just a partial fan patch, I was already a huge fan of Yamato for having a way more likable personality than any visual novel protagonist I'd read up to that point. In fact, for a long time, he was pretty easily my second favorite visual novel protagonist, only behind Kenichi from Shara no Kuni, who's basically been my #1 visual novel protagonist for like forever. Back when Majikoi first got its fan translation, this was during a time when Battle of Wits anime like Death Note and Code Geass were super big. Sadly, decades later, shows like this have become rare, with Kakegururi being the only modernist show to be nearly as entertaining as those. I bring this up because Yamato has a gray area morality similar to Battle of Wits protagonists like Light Yagami and Lelouch v Britannia, but with Yamato naturally tuned to fit a much more lighthearted, comedy-focused visual novel. This leads Yamato to be very smart and calculating while using his many social connections to take advantage and trick people to one-up others in competitions, especially since he's nowhere near physically strong as the superpowered female characters. In addition to moments where he naturally wins with his intellect, he has his own intellectual bisexual rival, June from Class 2S, which makes for some really fun back and forth exchanges, though I do wish June's flirting with him was cut down a bit. But Yamato being so smart while still being loyal to his friend group humanizes him much more than characters like Light and Lelouch, who while fun as protagonists ultimately are basically villains. Sadly, as much as I love Yamato, he does ultimately lead to one of the few big issues I have with Majikoi as a whole: his tendency to occasionally snuggle grape people. Look no further than Chris's route, where it has Yamato who resolved her route drama by graping her in her sleep, which, yeah, not the best plot twist in this game. What doesn't help is that it worked, and Chris treats the whole thing like she was at fault, which sadly means this whole scene basically ruined Chris's route for me, even though it was really good before this part. While Yamato has only done this type of stuff maybe a few more times throughout the whole Majikoi series, having this precedent start in one of the original's main routes has at points made me reconsider the original Majikoi visual novel as my #1 favorite ever. Thankfully, the very few flaws I have with Majikoi are easily negated with its equivalent of a true route, the agave route. This is by far the most serious route in the whole series that goes all in on drama, yet somehow keeps the relatively lighthearted, goofy tone without feeling jarring. I'm not going to spoil what happens, but all the buildup of serious elements foreshadowed in other routes leads to really cool, yet surprisingly emotional fight scenes. Most importantly, I'll call it by far the most Kazama family centered route. As I said earlier in this video, the Kazama family is basically my lifeblood for this series. Having a route focused on the ultimate friendship between them, no romance, just the plot testing their friendship bonds, while involving many side characters, not only makes Agave likely my favorite Majikoi route, but also possibly my favorite true route in any visual novel. I could legitimately go on ranting about why Majikoi Love Me Seriously is my #1 favorite visual novel. There are so many little things I haven't mentioned yet that contribute to it still being my favorite visual novel over a decade later, but I have to stop somewhere. I think you get my point by now. Majikoi is essentially my ultimate jack-of-all-trades visual novel. It just does so many things well, having a very memorable protagonist and heroines, along with surprisingly good romance, easily my favorite friend group in any media, good, concise, but memorable action scenes, goofy, unique, over-the-top comedy, and occasionally good drama, all somehow mixed together in one package. While I still love all future Majikoi sequels and fanfics for what they are, when I consider each visual novel individually, none come close to matching the overall quality of the OG Majikoi. I'm very grateful I was able to find it through that fan translation all those years ago and still continue hyping it up and promoting it to as many upcoming visual novel fans today.